Pour écouter cette session en français, veuillez cliquer en bas de votre écran sur l'onglet Interprétation et sélectionner le drapeau français.
Hello, bonjour.
Habari za leo.
On behalf of ICLEI Africa, the Africa Center for Cities, Our Future Cities,
Surge Africa and the Red Cross Crescent Climate Center,
We are delighted to welcome you to the Rise Africa 2023 Action Festival.
Rise Africa is a platform that brings together thinkers, doers, and enablers
to inspire action for sustainable cities.
This is the third edition of our virtual festival.
it brings together insights, practices, and visions from across the continent.
This year's theme is The Cities We Want.
the cities we want.
the cities we want.
The cities we want.
This mirrors the African Union 2063 Agenda vision, the Africa we want.
It is a wonderful Pan-African call for transformative change.
However, the agenda does not adequately embrace urbanization as a potential positive force for improving prosperity, inclusivity, and environmental well-being on the continent.
We need more emphasis on the role of cities and local action. And this festival aims to provide inputs into this agenda.
The cities we have are
Expanding,
incomplete,
inventive,
contested,
facing impending crisis, yet brimming with potential.
The cities we want are
people-centered,
Safe and healthy,
beacons of culture,
unflinchingly modern.
and adapting to change and leading global innovation.
We'll make these cities through
Experimenting,
learning
collaborating,
and amplifying the everyday actions of people who are shaping their cities.
The festival invites you to embrace different ways of knowing,
It invites you to forge new partnerships,
Experiment with new concepts and ideas.
to seek ways to bridge science, business, policy, and the arts.
Together, let's enter this space in the spirit of poetic possibilities.
Nous venons tous de diverses cités, et c'est cela vraiment notre diversité, la force formidable de notre continent. Et pourtant, nous marchons encore sur des routes fragiles. Comment construire notre Afrique avec ce terme malhabile, cette allure galvaudée loin des initiatives qui pourraient de nos villes faire une place active? Et que dire? Que dire à présent de notre gestion, de l'eau que l'on gaspille parfois sans concession, des ordures recyclables mais jamais recyclées, de ces paysages admirables mais bien souvent trop gâchés? L'histoire rappelle que c'est l'Afrique qui nous rassemble et que pour la construire, il faut agir ensemble. Moi, je veux une révolution de nos villes. Je les veux plus vertes et je veux de l'accueil des cités merveilleuses. Et puis, bon pied, bon œil, au gré de leurs histoires sur les pas d'une histoire. Car nos villes, c'est l'aventure. Nos villes sont nos miroirs. Pour l'urbanisme intelligent, nos villes nous appellent et nous interpellent pour l'action maintenant.
Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to you all to the Rise Africa session focused on the funding we need, specifically African cities at the forefront of the climate finance agenda. Please note that this session is being recorded and we hope to have your fruitful participation in the session. So within this session, what we aim to do is to harness strong collaboration between a diverse set of actors to co-create what is needed to realize the vision of the sustainable cities we hope to see across Africa and the type of finance necessary to do so. We would like to learn from you all as the leaders in your cities and across this region regarding the gaps and the challenges that you face in defining a vision, accessing appropriate finance, and implementing the necessary frameworks, projects, and programs. We hope to gather insights from you as local project proponents, financiers, platforms, officials, networks, and our development counterparts regarding what it takes to implement sustainability across Africa's cities. We aim to do this in the hopes of shaping the urban African finance landscape alongside cities and subnational governments to enable them to play a greater leadership role in the sustainable project development cycle in order to unlock access to sustainable finance and realize the cities that we want on the continent to ensure a secure, prosperous, and sustainable future. As such, we will begin by going over the house rules and providing you with an icebreaker to ensure that you're engaged with the session. And then my colleague will offer you an overview of the state of sustainable development finance for African cities. Following this, we will move into breakout rooms so that we are more able to deeply engage in the state of development finance for African cities and understand the real gaps and challenges in achieving these. And then finally, we'll have a reporting back from our rapporteurs to outline the themes identified in each breakout room, and then we will have a summary, way forward, and closing. So please note that our house rules are the following. Please raise your hand if you wish to speak. Please ensure that your microphone is muted when you are not speaking. Please ensure to maintain an engaging and respectful atmosphere. And then we hope to follow the rule of two, namely allowing at least 2 other participants to speak before raising your hand again. Next slide, please. So as our first icebreaker, we would like you to comment your name, the country that you're dialing in from, and your preferred language between English and French in the chat. Please go ahead and fill in your name, country, and preferred language between English and French in the chat. So we have Fru Wonka calling in from South Africa, who speaks English. We have Ryan from South Africa, English. We have Zerek Smith from Democratic Republic of Congo, English. We have Snare, South Africa, who speaks English. Please continue to comment your name, your country, and your preferred language in the chat. We would love to hear where you're calling from to get an understanding. We have Amin from Spain who speaks English as well. We have Nangamso Mklonto from South Africa who speaks English as well. That's really great. We have a lot of representation from South Africa, it seems. We have Emily calling from the UK who also speaks English, as well as Fumi from Cape Town who speaks English. So it's really great that we have South Africa present in the room alongside DRC, Spain, the UK, as well as people happy to interact in French as well. So moving on to our next icebreaker, we would like to hear from you. What percentage of the Earth's land surface do cities cover? Do you believe that it's A, 3%, B, 10%, C, 22%, or D, 30%? Let us know your thoughts of what percentage of the Earth's land surface cities cover. Please do let us know in the chat. 22%, 30%, 22% from me. Okay, so far 22% is our most popular answer. 10%, Emily says 30%. Well, interestingly enough, the correct answer has not been submitted as yet, while Nontu has responded. It's actually 3% of the Earth's land surface are covered by cities, which is really interesting. If we can move on to our third icebreaker activity, because, you know, if cities are only 3% of our Earth's land surface, why should we care that much about them? What percentage of global carbon dioxide emissions come from cities? Is it 3%? Is it 25%? Is it 70% or 90%? So 3% of the Earth's land cover, how much emissions come from them? 90% from non-2, 90%, 90%. Ryan says 70%. Okay. Emily says 70%. Okay. Interesting. Well, the correct answer actually is 70%. So cities are only 3% of the Earth's land cover, yet they account for 70% of carbon dioxide emissions. So clearly these are both a contributor to carbon dioxide emissions, but also an opportunity to harness the energy that cities really have to curb emissions and adapt to climate change. So on to the next slide. How much investment is required to make cities sustainable globally? Is it A, 57 trillion, B, 82 trillion, or C, 93 trillion? And that is trillion with a T. Please put your answers in the chat. 93 trillion. Okay, starting very high. 82 trillion. Emily says 93 trillion. Okay. Ryan says 57, only 57 trillion, Ryan. Okay, interesting. Okay, so there's quite a large variation between what everyone believes. Well, this is actually quite interesting because it depends where you get your estimates from and what those estimates include. So 57, the correct answer is actually all of them, because UNEP says that it's 57 trillion, the OECD says it's 82 trillion, and the Standing Committee of Finance of the UNFCCC says it's a whopping 93 trillion. So there's large variations depending on, what's being measured and how the measurements are taken. So in this case, you are all correct. So moving on, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Ryan Roberts, who will give you an overview of the state of sustainable development finance for cities in Africa. Over to you, Ryan.
Thanks so much, Natalie. That was a great icebreaker, and welcome to everyone. So my name is Ryan Roberts. I'm a specialist in climate finance at ICLEI Africa. And my presentation is really just to set the scene and also to perhaps stir the pot for the breakout rooms that we're going to have later on today. I think the essence of this session is really to get your thoughts and your views on what finance should be doing and what finance we want for our African cities. So I'm going to present a few slides, hopefully to stir some thought. And hopefully from there, you'll all be chomping at the bit to give your views on the finance landscape within our urban African cities. Next slide, please, Sadie. So I think first, just to clarify, is that yes, this session is focusing on climate finance, and climate finance in the technical world. Hopefully you can see my video now. It does fit into a broader sustainable finance landscape. Sort of fits within environmental finance and within climate finance, and climate finance within that. But I think given the socioeconomic challenges we face on the African continent, it's crucial for this climate finance to also sort of, affect social development and economic development, and vice versa. I think it's important for economic development and social development financing to start thinking more about the climate and their impacts on the climate when we think about development. Next slide, please, Sadie. So these few slides really come from our thoughts as ICLEI Africa and our work when in this finance landscape. A lot of our work involves trying to develop projects to accessing finance and trying to work backwards and helping to develop financing mechanisms that are suitable for cities. And what we're starting to see is that there is really these gaps when it comes to what the city wants and what the city can provide, and what financiers want and what they're from projects. So project gap, it's well known. Financiers say there are not enough good projects. Cities say we have a lot of projects, but developing that project to a decent standard, there's a massive gap there. Skills gap, there's a massive capacity gap within our cities to accessing finance and understand what financiers want and also how to implement finance. There is also, the big issue of risk. A lot of our cities are seen as below investment grade, or they're seen as risky investments. Yet at the same time, there's been a lot of critique that, it's actually risky not to invest in our cities, given the key role that cities play in combating some of the effects of the climate change. Next slide, please, Sadie. And I think this sums up a lot of the work that we do. And I think this diagram sums up a lot of the challenges that cities face. I think the first thing that's obvious is in this project financing process, there are a number of steps that a project needs to go through when accessing finance. There are a number of these different steps, and this is quite a timely process and also quite resource intensive. Another thing that's important to think about is the amount of stakeholders involved when it comes to developing a project, taking it right from a problem through to a concept, some sort of number crunching, some sort of matchmaking to funding, then there's financing, contracting, and then there is only implementation right at the end. And probably a key component is this monitoring and evaluation, which I don't think happens enough, that can feed back some of the lessons learned throughout this whole process, right back to the beginning stages of project developments. And another key aspect to remember is, city officials are already quite strained when it comes to capacity and resources. And now we're asking them to travel this long journey and also to engage with these multiple actors to try and get projects off the ground. And it can sometimes seem like an impossible task. It is done, but this is where we need to start thinking a bit more broadly. Next slide, please, Sadie. And yeah, I think this is the crux of why we're here today. I think on the left, we have cities that are very diverse. The projects are very diverse. The operational models are very diverse. And they also have their own different government structures. And these cities then develop projects. And on the right-hand side, we really have, the financing landscape that's very risk averse, and it's very much focused on generating profits and doing things in a very structured manner. A lot of times the financing solutions are quite uniform and standardized. And what we're trying to do is really trying to bring these two sides together and come up with, some sort of financing solution that is suitable for both. And I think that's really why we're here today, is because we're starting to see that a lot of the work that we do is dictated more by the right-hand side and less about the left-hand side. And I think it's important to remember that, finance and money essentially is man created, and it's meant to serve society. When financing is influencing development, it's actually the tail wagging the dog. And it's important to remember that finance is always a means to an end, and it's not an end in itself. And what we're really striving for is the impact that these projects or initiatives can bring. And finance is just a tool or a mechanism or resource to get there. Next slide, please, Sadie. So now I just want to flick through a lot of financing, different types that we see flowing through Africa and urban African cities. obvious one that we're here today is climate finance. And as we see, there's a lot, I think there's a lot of different stats and numbers on this slide, but in essence there is a lot of climate finance out there. Africa itself needs a lot of money to adapt to the effects of climate change and to mitigate against climate change. But not enough is coming to Africa. That stat that only 3% of climate finance is coming to Africa is quite a startling one. Then when we zoom in a bit further, we see that, that number is even less for cities. Only 3% of that is going to cities. We then look at just a bit of a regional breakdown of where that finance is going, and we can see that in all regions, they fall short. So it's not really concentrated in one region. Across the board, a lot more money needs to go to our African countries and cities to achieve the NDCs. And the bottom right is the broken promise. And I think this also links into the loss and damages conversation, is that yes, more is needed. But today I really want to flip the conversation around, it's not only we need more, but we need more of what? What do we want our finance to be doing? I think gone is the conversation of more or less. We now need to be a bit more proactive in saying, yes, we want more, but we want more of this, this, and that. And because we believe that this can help Africa and African cities achieve its developmental agenda. Next slide, please, Sadie. Great. So donor funding, this is also crucial. A lot of money has been spent within Africa, also across the continent. And ODA funding keeps rising, it's going up and up and up. I think at the moment it sits at around 63 million USD annually. And then if you compare this to, Africa's levels of growth or development, we start to think that is ODA assistance achieving what is meant to achieve? There is a lot of critique on ODA assistance. Next slide, please, Sadie. And not only is it the current ODA contributions haven't achieved too much, at least this critique said, there is also not enough. I think the international recommended standard is 0.7% for a lot of the OECD development countries, and currently we sit at around half. So I think today we really want to say, is ODA working? Is it not? If not, why not? And do we want to see more of this? Another popular talking point is who should be funded. Should it be the public sector, with their developmental hats on and their their role in society, or should it be the private sector? Should they play a stronger role in trying to achieve, in trying to improve the state of African cities? When you unpack the private sector a bit more, we should also be thinking, what should national government be doing? What should local government be doing? And also, if we zoom out even more, considering the background to the theme of Rise Africa, it's what should the African Union be doing? What should we as a continent, how should we be, thinking about how finance can work to develop our cities? If you zoom into the private sector, it's, do we want more big multinational conglomerates investing in our cities? Or do we want locally based SMMEs to be thriving? If it is the latter, how do we do this? Finance, what type of finance? What can make this work? Or next slide, please, Sadie. Or is it something in the middle? There's been a lot of hype around public-private partnerships. And I think there's some good case studies and there's some bad case studies. And I think we need to start, will this work? In what context can public-private partnerships work? And also, what type of financing is needed to get public and private partnerships rolling on at a city level within Africa? Next slide, please, Sadie. There's also a lot of conversation going around alternative financing, and I think there's a big aspect of this is microfinancing. I think we've talked a lot about international financing, national financing, and city level financing. But what about a bottom-up approach where we have, households and communities being able to access finance and being able to drive their own development? This is another, I think in a previous RISE session, Stockville's came up, which is also really important to communities and cities in helping them, bridge the finance gaps that they see in their day-to-day life. Next slide, please. But we also need to be aware that microfinance has its pros and its cons. And we need to say, well, in what context can microfinancing work? Or what safeguards can we put in place to ensure that it has the impacts that we want it to achieve? So hopefully this brief presentation stirred the pot enough. And we really want to now break out into different breakout rooms. I think we'll have 2 breakout rooms where we'll be asking 4 main points. And the idea of this session is really to get your thoughts on what we want from financing for our African cities. And then after this breakout rooms, we'll compile all of these and we'll ask some rapporteurs to please report back to the plenary. And then we'll sum up and have a bit of an open discussion as to why everyone thought, why everyone gave the views that they did. So back over to you, Natalie. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ryan. So our technical lead will be assigning you to your breakout rooms shortly. Perfect. Welcome to breakout room 1. So essentially what we want to get out of this session is to have a co-creation space where we discuss what we would like the state of sustainable finance to look like for African cities. So I would really encourage you all to raise your hands, to be engaged in this conversation so that we can have a fruitful discussion. So before I start, would anyone like to volunteer to rapporteur back to the plenary session at the end of this session? Is there anyone I can call on? Or perhaps we'll wait until the end of the session to assign a rapporteur. Okay, perfect. So these are the 4 key questions that we will be addressing throughout this breakout room. The first is, what should funding really look like? The second is, who should be providing that funding, as well as who should be the beneficiaries of that funding. Then we move on to the question, which is, what role would you or your organization like to play in the climate finance landscape, or rather the sustainable finance landscape? And then we'd really love to hear from you what the challenges that you face in accessing said financing are. So I'll begin with the first question, and please forgive me. I am going to exit the full screen because I need to be taking notes for the future rapporteuring. So the first question is, what should funding look like? Should the funding of future African cities come from climate finance? Should it come from development finance? Should it be coming from humanitarian aid? because this is a crisis that we're facing right now. Should it be in the form of grants? Should it be in the form of loans? Should it rather be venture capital? Should it be coming from the private sector or the public sector? Or should it be a combination through public-private partnerships? And which sector might not be doing enough? Should we be mobilizing our own domestic resources, or should we rather be looking out to international sources of funding? And then, you know, the benefits of blending and leveraging finance, which essentially is trying to use different types of finance to mitigate the risk associated with lending to risky African cities. Or should it be, you know, more innovative types of finance, such as microfinance, which was mentioned by my colleague Ryan. So I'd like to hear from the group, what do you believe that funding should look like for the sustainability of African cities? Would anyone like to volunteer? Please feel free to raise your hand. Alternatively, I will be picking a name from our participants. Amin, based on what you've heard, do you think, oh, Fumi, perfect. Fumi has their hand raised. What do you think funding should look like for sustainable African cities?
Hi, Natalie. Hi, everyone. I guess that's the reason why we're all here. And I don't think anyone has the question. But what I want to put out there is more like a provocateur as against the question particularly. There's this constant narrative, and this is me in my element as a rights-based person and always being touchy about so many things. There's this narrative around African cities being risky, so to speak. And yes, I get that there are financial measures used to gauge those risks. But the question is, are these measures truly and fundamentally in service of African development goals? Or are they measures developed by Western institutions used to, so to speak, coerce a narrative about our cities? And should our financial institutions on the continent, I'm looking at AFDB, I'm looking at the Afrexim Bank, and possibly maybe even, say, BRICS, the latest BRICS Bank, be coming up with a different set of metrics to measure risks within this country, within the cities? And shouldn't that be the measures that we look to, rather than these measures that are developed and benchmarked against Western ideals that we clearly know do not work in many developing contexts, especially not in Africa? So no, I do not have a question to you. I'm more or less throwing a curveball into your whole discourse. And that comes from the point of this constantly perceiving African cities as risky for investments, and based off that, a refusal to invest in the cities. And then it's a chicken and egg situation. We're back in the same situation where nobody wants to lend us money, yet we keep saying we need money to be able to move from point A to point B.
Absolutely. And what I'm hearing you're saying for me is, are the metrics used to measure riskiness really appropriate to the African context? And, you know, I don't necessarily have an answer for you. We're seeing the current discourse around reforming multilateral development banks, creating innovative instruments that are appropriate for emerging markets and developing economies. So, you know, I'd like to throw it back out to the rest of the audience, perhaps towards someone who might not be from the African continent, to understand, you know, should we be using the same metrics across the board? Are there any innovations that you've heard of in your line of work that may be more appropriate to the African or emerging market space? And just hear from you. And so I'm going to pick upon, who shall I pick upon? Zarek, can you let us know if you believe that, you know, these Western standards of risk and profitability are appropriate for the African continent, or even for African cities specifically?
Hi, Natalie. Hi, group. Appreciate Fumi's intervention, and I think this is a great question for sure. You know, as a representative of a donor, when I think about what funding should look like, I really understand, and my experience lends me to believe that blending and leveraged financing is really, at the end of the day, what's going to be the most effective for Africa. As it relates to Fumi's risk question, I think that's exactly why blending is so important. While donor funding, multilateral international institutions can give sort of seed funding, what's critical at the end of the day is private sector engagement and the funding that comes from the economic systems of African countries themselves and African cities. These are, in many ways, extraordinarily rich opportunities for funding that exist in and among private sector investors in African cities overall, notwithstanding the reality that they're much less developed than many other places in the world. There still has a great deal of funds available to them. And that's why I think a private sector focus, blended funding, looking at incentives to increase domestic investments is really the way to go forward. There's simply not enough donor money to go around, and that's why I would argue for domestic and/or blended funding as probably the way forward.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And Camille, I'd like to hear from you, just touching on Zarek's point. You know, do you think we should be incentivizing and mobilizing domestic investments? Should we be tapping into the private sector? How can we blend and leverage different types of finance to, first of all, get the scale of funding that we need, as well as the pace of funding that we need, but then in a way that's appropriate to the African cities context, which was mentioned by Fumi. I'd love to hear from you, Camille, if you're there.
Yes. Hi, Natalie. I'm there. I'm so sorry because I've just arrived in the conference. I had some internet issue, so I didn't hear the presentation before, so it won't be maybe very relevant what I can say. But yes, I think it's really key to have different sources of financing. And one of the way to try to get the financing is to have convincing projects. So, for example, in South Africa, but I'm not in South Africa for a long time, but I understand that one of the issue is that many funders think that there are lots of ideas, but the projects are not mature enough to reach the financing phase. So it really needs a focus on the preparation of the project and to have them really adapted to the just transition context. Yes, we knew here. Great. Yes. So yes, I think this is really interesting also to have as Zarek Smith said, to make a focus on the blending and to try to make some leverage between different kind of financing, grant, loans from public institution and from private institution to try to get the best of each partners. But yes, that's what I can say for now. Sorry, I just arrived, so maybe I will take I will say other things a bit later. Thank you.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for your perspective and your insights. It is absolutely true. In the beginning of the presentation, estimates go from 50 trillion to 100 trillion dollars needed to make our cities sustainable. And therefore, one stakeholder within the economy just is not going to be enough. We need to come together through a whole of society approach. So moving on to my next question, who should provide the funding? And we touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to know from you, who do you think is the most responsible to make African cities sustainable? Should it be government? Should it be in the hands of donors? Should it be in the hands of banks? And should it be in the hands of foreign investors? What are the pros and cons to that? Or should it be philanthropies working to make African cities sustainable? And then I'd love to hear about your thoughts on the polluter pays versus African innovation in the finance sector. We touched on this a little bit, and this is kind of like, who is most responsible, and therefore who should pick up the tab, for lack of a better phrase. Let me see who hasn't said anything yet. Amin, I'd love to hear from you. Who do you believe should be providing the funding to make our city sustainable?
Hello, everyone. I'm not going to be an expert in this one. I don't know if my answer would be relevant because let's say I'm coming from a completely different background and I'm working in Europe. So for me, maybe what I can tell you is what is happening in Europe and how we are developing perhaps this kind of, let's say, development. I'm coming from innovation, research and innovation background. I'm an innovation consultant here. And what we have seen is that, of course, the Central European Union, let's say, if you want to call it a government or let's say, decision-making tools, that provide this financing for development inside the cities. But as I said, it's completely different reality. I'm not aware of what is happening perhaps in Africa, and I cannot tell what perhaps would be the best way to go. As I said, I can just comment on what is happening here. My, let's say, background, as I mentioned, is mainly European projects, research and development, and I'm working mainly in energy access in Africa, in a couple of projects that European Union has been funding in Africa. So that's, let's say, basically where I'm coming from. Sorry, couldn't be more about.
No, that was very helpful, and I'd actually like to throw it back to you because you might express that you are unaware of what's happening in Africa. But if we look at this polluter pays principle, it's going to be coming from, the European Union. So it may be affecting you indirectly without you noticing. Do you have any thoughts on that? Should it be the polluter pays? Should it be domestically led?
This has been a, let's say, very complex, of course, a situation at the global level, because we all know that everybody should do it, or nobody can be. Let's say, okay, Europe alone cannot tackle climate change, or the United States. Everybody should work together. There is no way that we can do. But of course, there has been some talks regarding perhaps in Europe at least, CO2 taxation, carbon footprint. Of course, apart from the price, there are some talks, for example, to put on a packages or a product that we produce, the carbon footprint of that product. So, for example, the consumer will make it more, perhaps, let's say, more aware of what is the product coming from, or what is the carbon footprint of it. Apart from that, there are some talks also in Europe regarding the CO2 taxation, right? Because as I mentioned, for example, one big issue in Europe is that steel manufacturing probably. Chinese manufacturer can provide quite cheaper, for example, steel, which of course goes with a lot of carbon footprint there, while European steel manufacturer cannot compete. So that's also has been considered. That would be a CO2 taxation. Is also can be something that perhaps can be considered in here. But again, the problem is always the agreement, a framework reference, right? At the global level, that we all agree, okay, this is a way that we have to perhaps even calculate carbon footprint. There's no, let's say, real agreement right now, global level, how we can also calculate that. Forget about the framework of reference, and then it goes to the, let's say, very much more complex situation of raising tarifas, or I don't know, taxation on a specific product, which I don't know if global system that we have right now currently is available to handle that kind of system. But definitely, at least in Europe, they are going toward that inside Europe, but I don't know how visible is it at the global level. Sorry, I think I talked too much, but anyway.
No, we are so grateful for your contributions and that you're so engaged and that you're giving us so many ideas. I'd like to hear from Yasmin. What different types of roles do you think different types of financial actors play? What role should the government be playing in providing or creating an enabling framework to ensure that funding flows? What role should donors be playing? What role should banks be playing? How can we incentivize or disincentivize various actors within the financial community to ensure that we try to make African cities sustainable? Do you have any thoughts on the different roles that each of the stakeholders can play? Yasmin?
Oh, thanks, Natalie. That's very many questions all rolled into one. I think we need to, apart from the funding, decide on our respective roles and responsibilities on achieving the outcomes and tackling the challenges first. Before we ascribe roles in terms of who pays for what and how they do that. You know, it differs so much when you talk about the role of the state. It's defined really differently in different countries. Is the state willing to take more of a social welfare approach? Is the private sector moving from a purely capitalist approach to a more triple bottom line or more social impact type of role that they would like to play? And I think that the defining our respective roles in relation to the challenge and in relation to what we would like to see happening in terms of real outcome and impact comes first before we decide on who pays for what.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that intervention, Yasmin. And for me, just to throw it back to you, since you raised the challenge in the previous question regarding whether the metrics are appropriate, what innovations have you seen from the African local context that you would like to share? Any success stories in terms of ensuring sustainable cities on the continent are financed?
Thanks, Natalie. None immediately come to mind, but just maybe a broader context or a broader frame that many of the innovations and even just thinking about some projects across the continent that have embodied sustainability and that over the years have outlived even the naysayers have been those that have developed ground up. So this thing around looking inwards is not just the tagline or a nice byline. It's also a question of us asking ourselves, and particularly with the broader framework of where we want to be in another 30 years, given the Agenda 2063, how does the continent begin to self-sustain over and above what it receives as aid from foreign donors? And what are the things that we need to put in place? And I mean, there are different forms. You alluded earlier to within community kind of fundraising, and of course that also has the other side of it, trapping certain persons within debt. But there have also been success stories of that, and success stories within how communities generated funds. Good, a great one. There's the Igbo apprenticeship system, and it's a system that outlives and outdates colonialism, and is a system that several decades post-colonialism still works in terms of raising capital, in terms of quickly sprawling, in terms of the number of people who are able to say they can start off their own businesses without falling into the debt trap. And is an apprenticeship system in southeastern Nigeria, wherein the person is attached to understudy a certain established business person. And within the years of service, he gives those years of service. And yes, there are many ethical and human rights issues attached to that, but it's a system that has seen to work, and is a system that, when you look generally at the long-term projections for many Igbos who come from southeastern Nigeria, and how that has in turn turned around finances for so many of them, has helped to lift up quite a huge number out of poverty. And are we looking inwards to take on board systems such as that and adopt them, of course, with maybe a better lens, maybe better protections in terms of labor rights, in terms of human rights protections? How can we adapt that to the new world order, but yet still maintain and be true to those indigenous systems that continue to lift people out of poverty, rather than the constant cap in hand narrative that we currently sit in?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just really so appreciate you sharing that perspective. And maybe it's that rather than trying to copy what's being done elsewhere, what we need to do is we need to learn from each other within our African cities, communities, and replicate and scale up these efforts that are proven over long periods of time, as you mentioned. So thank you for that. We'll now go to the next question, in which we will be asking, what are the challenges to accessing finance? So I'd like you all to speak a little bit about your experiences with African countries, with African cities, with sustainability, the types of barriers that you faced in accessing finance, or that you've heard about people, communities, countries facing, the type of support that's really needed to unlock this finance, as well as who should be resourcing that support. So how should we upskill those people who might not have the capacity to such a level at which they can actually access or at least compete on the same level as others? I'd love to hear about your experiences with receiving or dispersing finance in challenging contexts. It doesn't necessarily have to be the African city context, but just experiences with receiving as well as dispersing finance. And then just to talk a little bit about, going forward, what can help unlock access to finance for sustainable cities in Africa? And we haven't heard from you, Vincent, so I'd love to hear your perspective on these challenges and opportunities to accessing finance for sustainable cities in Africa.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. My background does not usually do a lot with finance. Usually, I am a fact-checking journalist, although I do deal with some city governance issues. It tends to be political relationships between national governments and subnational governments. Not so much climate finance. So from this session, I'm learning more than I'm giving. Let's just say that. But I think from my understanding of how people try to raise climate finance, a lot of it from an African perspective, depends on national governments lobbying at these great conferences, particularly the COPs, trying to extract money. And so that obviously depends on how much Western countries, feel they have to give. At subnational level and at individual level, there is always the question of, whether it's how they are accessing this finance, what they have to give. So if you're talking about, for example, issues around carbon credits, we've seen quite a bit of press coverage recently about the fact that a lot of the projects that are supposed to shield carbon or sequester carbon, like forests and things like that, it's not clear how viable they are. So and whether we are interfering with African countries, desire, need, and rights to use their land as they see fit, as opposed to compensating for use of resources by other countries. So I think that for me is the thing. How do countries in Africa and subnational units also just ensure they're getting enough money? Like, how do they know? How do we ensure the bargain is in our favor? How do we know we are not being taken for a song? Maybe we are happy with what we are getting, but could we get 10 times that, and we just don't know? Like, I think that ignorance about how the whole thing works prevents us from getting probably the value that we should. I think I should stop there because I don't know too much about this field.
No, I mean, you raised an incredible point, right? Because we had this arbitrary 100 billion an annum, which was agreed to at the COP negotiations that you mentioned, these international platforms. But now what African governments and a lot of developing and least developed country governments are basically doing now is lobbying for needs-based. So it's not just about what can we get, but it's what do we actually need. So you definitely know a lot more than you're letting on, and would love to delve into this a little bit more. Fru, you have your hands raised. We'd love to know your reflections on the challenges to accessing finance, as well as any opportunities, any experiences that you've had. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Natalie. And can you hear me from that end? So I'm going to draw from a project that ICLEI concluded last year, which was about investment opportunities in the agri-food system in Africa. And one of the things that we identified as a challenge in accessing finance because the project was dealing with informal traders and how they can access finance. And, informal traders who are also in the food system also have an impact in terms of carbon emission, and also waste in terms of waste on the landfill through lack of storage facilities. So one of the things that was identified that hinders access to finance was the issue of collateral. Now, because they are a small, medium enterprises, they lack collateral that can back. Like, for example, if I want to have a loan from the bank to increase my product, it's difficult for me to have that loan from a bank because I don't have a collateral to say, okay, if I take this loan, I'll be able to pay this, or this is what can be recouped for me if I don't pay. So that alone, the collateral is also a challenge that people face in terms of getting finances, particularly from banks. So one of the approach that was intended to put in place was through the market that these small businesses go and buy their products. So like having that market, the banks can give the loan through that market, and then now the market loan stands as a collateral now between the bank and the small businesses. So that is one of the support system that was raised as an opportunity to get small, medium enterprises access to finance.
Yeah, thank you so much for that concrete example. And I guess, yeah, as I said, it's a concrete example of risk mitigation and the innovative approaches that we really do need to take. So if we're going back to the original talking point, right, it was African cities are so risky. Well, what innovations can we make to, either separate from that perception or to actually mitigate that risk in line with their metrics? I'd like to hear from Zurich, who has their hand up.
Thanks, Natalie, and thanks to all the participants. This is a really great discussion. Let me just really quickly run through, from my perspective, what I think are the key challenges that we face in mobilizing finance for African cities in the climate sphere, and they're really not that different from more generic challenges related to finance mobilization. The first one is policy, right? Do the governments have the correct policies in place that are going to serve as incentives to private sector investors to give them the confidence that there's a return available to them? And in settings where correct policies are legislated and regularly implemented, I think there is a lot more likelihood of mobilizing finance. The second one is a history and a practice of patron clientelism. And by that, of course, I mean the ways in which political elite typically personalize the goods of state for their own personal gain. And in settings where political elites practice patron clientelism, it really is a negative incentive for private sector investors, because in those settings, it's very difficult for the private sector to realize profit and to mobilize large-scale financing. The third issue that I think resonates across many places in the continent, of course not everywhere, but certainly here in DRC where I sit, is chronic insecurity and instability. When we face civil wars, when we face regional conflict, then those realities on the ground mitigate against the ability to attract financing. And then finally, it's local capacity. Do we have the kind of local partners who can manage resources and who can appropriately account for resources that are invested? And so that really draws attention to the importance for organizations, donor organizations such as my own, to invest in local capacity building. Over.
Lovely, and that's great to hear that you're investing in local capacity building. So with that, I think we can move on to, I think, Zurich, you succinctly put together the challenges, but perhaps we can talk about what role each of our organizations can play in the finance landscape to create sustainable African cities. So the first question is surrounding how should actors work together? We know in the sustainability place that many people are doing many things in their silos. So how do we first of all develop a whole of society approach to ensure that we can develop sustainable African cities? The second one is a provocative one. Which stakeholder is not pulling their weight? which stakeholders should be doing more. The third one is, what should international level stakeholders be doing? What should national level stakeholders be doing? And then what should local stakeholders be doing? And then lastly, just for our own information, as you know, ICLEI Africa is a city network. So what role should we, ICLEI Africa, be playing as a city network that represents Africa in various ways, be playing in developing sustainable African cities? Let me see if there's anyone that we haven't heard from. Samantha Keane, we'd love to hear from you, what organization you're from, what role you think you can play, and how we can get actors to move beyond their silos towards a whole of society approach.
Thank you for the invitation, Natalie. Sadly, I joined rather late, so I haven't quite plugged into the conversation yet. So a very brief comment maybe on what I think has been useful very recently in Cape Town, and well, what I'm optimistic about is a role of networks in linking up within the space, and it's not a simple solution, because the question arises, you don't really want non-government organizations to be coming in and doing the work of local governments, but in terms of supporting and helping support capacity, we've seen some really good interactions between local and, I mean, provincial and municipal governments, and civil society organizations, community groups. And I think that, yeah, there's a lot of promise with this. So I'm keen to follow that up. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Samantha. Sadie, I'd like to hear from you. What type of work should various actors play in the finance landscape? You know, who should provide the expertise? Who should provide the capacity building? Who should be the bridge builder? Who should provide the networking spaces? Any thoughts from you, Sadie?
Hi, Natalie. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity. I think it's a tricky question, right? But I guess, I don't know, my thought at this point is that I think there can be perhaps more done by governments, not only governments, but this is just my thought at the moment, more done by governments to basically make it easier for local governments to kind of do what they need to do without more kind of national level regulations standing in the way. So I think a better sharing of roles almost, and sharing of responsibility between different levels. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this bureaucracy is a big disincentive to local governments, who of course have many roles and responsibilities with limited capacities and then limited ability to control their own resources. So absolutely, there needs to really be, you know, engagement on what each level of governance's role is and how to work together for the better. I'm trying to think who else I'd like to hear from. Camille, back to you. What other stakeholders can we bring into this work to develop sustainable African cities?
Thank you, Natalie. I just had an idea not directly linked to that question, but maybe in addition to a better sharing of the responsibilities and role, I think one of the role of the public finance would be to try to promote more risk sharing, because in a partnership, the risk has to be shared. and often it's the risk is only on one of the partner. So I think we should try to promote that. I don't know how to do it, but I think like the idea would be interesting to deepen. And also on the public finance institution side, I think one of our role is, as you said, to also try to promote the network between peer-to-peer experts, between each kind of each level of institution. And for example, in South Africa, we are working with one city which is very advanced, who is conducting very interesting, innovative project in terms of catchment management. And so it is very interesting to make that public and that it can be used by other municipalities and other cities all around the world to try to promote the best practices. I think it's also one of the role of the GFI to try to do that networking, of course, with the help of network like yours, of course.
Thank you so much, Camille. That was really insightful. So we have about 4 minutes left of this session, and I would like to hear if anyone would like to volunteer to rapporteur. Otherwise, I have my eye on a rapporteur. So would anyone like to volunteer to rapporteur in the meantime? It definitely cannot be me presenting the themes that came up during the plenary. I have all the notes, so I'll add those to the slides to support you. Would anyone like to volunteer? Otherwise, I shall randomly choose Vincent. Would you be willing to rapporteur back to the plenary just what we spoke about? I'll include the notes in the slide to help you.
Wow, a lot of this is so new. So
yes.
Having the notes would really help. I don't know how I get to access.
So can you see my screen right now?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Okay, I'm just gonna put the notes in here and the last notes. So you can just have a practice to try summarize all the various topics that we discussed. So these were the key questions in terms of what should funding look like. This is essentially what we tried to discuss. So perhaps please feel free to go ahead and let me know when you'd like to go over to the next slide. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Okay, so I can see these metrics appropriate. When I just want to know if it would be good to be able to have a glance at these during the plenary. It would really help because that will help me talk a bit more with my notes. Let me see.
Yes, I'll have the slides up for you.
Okay, then let's see how it goes.
Okay, perfect. Do you want to practice, just talk about some of the themes you heard raised so that anyone can just add anything that they don't feel was fully captured that they would really like for it to be heard in the plenary?
Yeah, sure. So I think that...
Oh, sorry, Vincent. So we have 10 seconds. So you might have to wing it, but the notes and the slides will be up for you.
Okay.
Okay.
No problem.
Okay. Thank you
Let's
so
see
much.
how it goes. Let's see how it goes.
It'll grow great. Thank you everyone for all your contributions. They were very valuable. I wasn't expecting the conversation to go the direction it did, but I'm really grateful to each one of you for your contributions. So we will see you in the plenary. Thank you.
Hi, team. I think we're all back here.
Okay, perfect. Sadie, do you mind? Oh, sorry. So right now we will be having reflections from the various breakout rooms. So I guess we'll start with my breakout room, which was the plenary, unless the second breakout room would like to go first. Okay, so we'll have our breakout room go first, and we will be having some reflections from Vincent. So let me quickly share my screen so that he can see some of the notes that we took during our presentation. So when you are ready, Vincent, please go ahead.
Hello. So yes, I'm ready. So those are the 4 key questions that if we I just want to look at the 4 key questions, we can get a decent look at them. So what should funding look like? Who should provide it? What role would you like to play? And what are the challenges? Then moving on. So in terms of what the funding should look like, so are the metrics appropriate? And this was a debate between who should decide what the metrics are. Is it the countries receiving the funding, or the Western countries deciding what to fund based on their budgets and what they want to achieve? And then what we came up with was that blended financing, where financing that enables the parties involved to then obtain more financing, and leveraging would be appropriate. It would be good to incentivize domestic investments in the country and private sector funding, and different sources in case one source of funding does not work out. You can switch to another. And then the importance of the projects is very important, because they bring people on board. And if the projects are not mature enough, that may disable the funding or make it less certain. And the projects need to be prepared to the point where they are ready to go. So you don't start thinking about how to implement when you're talking to your funder. So who should provide the funding? And is it governments, donors, banks, foreign investors, philanthropies? So obviously, when you're dealing with that, so these were our findings. So everyone should do it, everyone who's mentioned. And then there was the point of, overconsumption. So if probably, Natalie, you may want to stress on what we agreed by the meaning of overconsumption. Is it that too much funding is availed more than is necessary?
So essentially, this was when we were discussing the polluter pays principle, and we were talking about, should those economies where overconsumption is rife be the ones essentially supporting the countries
right.
in the consumption? Yeah.
Oh, okay. So the countries that cause a lot of the emissions, should they be the ones to provide the funding? And then how do you incentivize or disincentivize people to provide funding so that they feel like they are doing the right thing, or they're being forced? And then who's responsible before you decide who's paying for what? Because then how do we know who's responsible for ensuring that the funds are used as appropriate? And how does each stakeholder work, given whether it's government, whether it's a philanthropy, whether it's a private sector? And then how does the continent get self-sufficient and stop being reliant on finance from other sources. And then we can think about solutions that have proven to be successful within Africa, so that we're not necessarily focused on things that are not necessarily proven to work. So what are the challenges to accessing this finance? So there are quite a few. So the first one concerns national governments lobbying at international contexts, like the annual COP meetings. A lot of that means that they have to come and try to negotiate a lot of money within a short time. And then at subnational level, you have issues around the integrity of things like carbon credits and the agency of communities to actually make sure that they are being served by these arrangements. How do African countries and cities ensure they're getting what they actually need? So you have a situation where they're probably getting paid some money, but is it even enough? Is it what they should be paid? By transiting to need,
Hi, Vincent. So you have, unfortunately, I think we've lost you. Can you hear us? Okay. It seems that we have lost Vincent. May I have perhaps Fru from our previous session continue until we can get Vincent back to continue rapporteuring?
So continuing from where Vincent ended, in terms of what are the challenges to accessing finance, we also talked about the issue of collateral, where small and medium enterprises find it challenging to have access to finance due to the lack of collateral. And one of the solutions could be like the market in which they get their products can be used as a middleman to access the finance, and then they serve as a collateral to the small and medium enterprises. And also, one of the things was also in terms of the policies in place need to also incentivize both private sectors in investment and ensuring that the returns are there. And then we also talked about in terms of instability also is one of the factors that can also like hinder access to finance and also developing local capacity. And then another one was, what role would you like to play in the finance landscape? And one of the key things that came out from that is there should be a network where everyone comes now in place, and also the responsibility should be shared, and the government needs to take a lead in most of those things. I think that's basically the main point that came out from this.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Fru, for that. On to the second breakout room. Ryan, we'd love to hear from your breakout room.
Thanks, Natalie. I think I'm going to share my screen, and I'm a little bit worried about time. So I think I might just compare our notes with breakout group number 1. I think there are a lot of similarities, and we'll just sum up for the plenary as a whole. So let's go here. There. Can everyone see my screen? Great. So our conversation was a little bit all over the show. It wasn't as neat as breakout room number 1, but I do think we got some real nuggets of wisdom out of this, and I think there's a lot of similarities to breakout 1. So I think the first comment on what funding should look like, it was quite clear that I think the historical contributors of GHG emitters, perhaps your first world countries or your global north, should definitely be providing a majority of the climate finance, and this should be in the form of non-repayable grants. But we do need to start thinking about how effective this finance is. And, there needs to be some other metric or lens on how effective this is to start monitoring what is good, what is not good, and what should we be pursuing. We shouldn't be restrictive on the implementation sources or the types of finance, but rather the effectiveness should be our guiding star as to what we should be preferring or not be preferring. I think it very much links to your point on who should be paying and who should not be paying. There also needs to be tying in with that is, yes, the funding can flow from top down, but there needs to be a lot more of a collaborative approach as to what the funding should be funding. And that's where the Global South needs to have a bit more of a stronger voice. Then there was a lot of conversation around accountability, monitoring of success, and how do we determine if it is successful? What is success? I think this needs to be a bit more unpacked, and I know this is a very new sector, but it's something that needs to be, I think, better defined. The monitoring of how what makes a project successful, and is there accountability for government structures, financiers, private sector when a project isn't successful? Is there some sort of accountability structure? Then there was also another comment on a lot of private sector specific funding. There is not enough of private sector funding in going into climate finance, and there needs to be more private sector funding specifically into adaptation projects. And that also leads on to this question of what are our metrics when it comes to adaptation? Are they measurable? What should be our key performance indicators when it comes to adaptation projects? As to who should be providing the funds, I think we did talk about it a lot in the first slide, and that's perfectly okay. But there was more of a question on, governments themselves should have some autonomy, and local governments specifically should be able to raise their own finance to finance and implement projects by themselves. In some African countries, it's very top down, and for climate finance to get to a specific city, it has to flow through a national government. In saying that, we also need to, local governments need to look internally and say, well, are we attractive to receive climate finance? And we need to improve our own systems, capacity, structures, so that we can say to financiers, we are willing to, we are able to implement climate finance projects and deliver on the impacts that we say we can deliver on. There was talk on, who should be providing also and at what stage. And there was a great comment on public sector finance should perhaps be more focused to project preparation, and private sector finance should perhaps be more into actual investment of projects. So there, I think it's quite nice to start delineating is where the public sector should play more of a role, where the private sector should play more of a role, or the financing sector. Yeah, and then I think there was a lot more discussions around, government making itself more finance ready, and especially within the conversation of South Africa, there is a lot of reports of corruption. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. Just energy transition is a big theme, but government needs to structure itself to be able to access this funding in a lot better, in a better way. Last slide, some of the challenges to accessing funding. Once again, we talked about this a lot previously, but we did, I think one point that was quite interesting was that financiers may need to be more accepting of risky projects and maybe take a bit of a bold step. especially the private sector, but maybe there needs to be some greater liquidity, so that once an investor has invested, and if they see a project is really going bad, they can exit. Or, perhaps, it's a case of we need certain investors to invest in these specific projects just so that these projects get out of the risky stage. And then once they're implementing and operating, that's when other sources of funding can come in. There was another point on some of the access. So in a lot of the rural areas, a lot of communities are not aware of what funding sources are out there. And the first port of call is always national governments. And that's not always, in most countries, not always the best place. And actually, I think this also ties on to quite a key point that got mentioned right in our very first slide. We had some students in our group, and I think they made it clear that they actually don't learn too much about developmental finance and climate finance in their curriculum. And considering the importance of it in development itself, that was quite startling to me, and perhaps needs to be addressed a bit further. The last 2 points also were really good. It's about supporting the entire urban climate governance realm. When we start talking about finance, we can't just look at a project specifically. We need to start looking about enabling policy and planning from which these projects emanate, as well as targets. So how are these projects contributing to targets? And lastly, local intermediaries are really important for cities, and to help them improve the opportunities for cities to access finance. We ran a bit out of time, so I don't want to go too much, I think, on what role we would like to play, because we only really got Emily from CDP to give a bit more of an in-depth, but perhaps I can hand back over to you, Natalie. I think there were a lot of similarities between the two groups, which are great. And now it's up to us to compile all those thoughts, and we will be compiling a short report on what were the main takeaways. And I think this is really helpful for us internally as ICLEI Africa. We play a big role in lobbying and policy and advocacy, and we do have quite a big presence on a lot of international forums and the local level, hosting a lot of sessions, events, and it's great for us to get these views so we can start feeding these thoughts into our work and starting to influencing the financing ecosystem, but then also helping our cities and helping to change our cities so that they are more suitable to accessing climate finance, which is important. Over to you, Natalie.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you to our participants who were really the heart and soul of this webinar. Thank you to the RISE Africa team who supported us in making this, ensuring that this was successful. Sadie will put my email address in the chat room in case you want to have any follow-ups. But as Ryan mentioned, we will be sharing a short report about the outcomes of the session. We really and truly appreciate each and every one of your contributions. And I think the last thing that I can take away from this is that, it's our Africa and it's our future, and we need to play more of a leadership role in determining what that is going to look like. So yes, thank you so much, everybody. If anyone has anything that they would like to share in the last minute or so, please ensure that you fill in the survey that RISE Africa will be sharing shortly. And I wish you all a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. Thank you once again for making this session such a success and contributing to the sustainability of African cities. Thank you very much all.